Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to have all of you joining us today. During today's webinar, our panelists will discuss their current high-impact tutoring initiatives. They'll share their thoughts on what it takes to bring a successful tutoring program to scale, and some of the challenges and successes they've achieved in the process. We'll also discuss some of the key considerations and best practices for this work. And we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and learn more about what's working in these programs. Our dynamic lineup of speakers today includes Education Commissioner Penny Schwinn of Tennessee and Kenneth Stowe, Interim Director of Curriculum and Instruction from the New Mexico Public Education Department. Both will be in a conversation with AJ Gutierrez, co-founder, vice chair, and CMO of the national nonprofit Saga Education, which, by the way, is leading some incredible work with states and districts to increase access to tutoring for all students. On that note, we'd like to thank our partners who help make events like this one possible. We appreciate your continued partnership and support. And we look forward to hosting this webinar series with you and with state education leaders throughout this year. Lastly, to our audience, please take a moment to place your questions in the chat for the Q&A portion of today's session. AJ, the virtual floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mayusa. Really appreciate it. I'm so thrilled to be here. I look forward to a great conversation with both Commissioner Schwinn and Ken. But before we get started, I'd like to ground us and give you a quick snapshot of what is happening with high impact tutoring across the United States. Starting off with a question that's on probably many of your minds right now, which is, what is high impact tutoring? It starts with recognizing that not all tutoring is created equal, and there are specific tenets that evidence shows that leads to success. And what you see outlined here is based off of evaluations and large-scale meta-analysis conducted by Brown University, by JPL North America, which is based out of MIT, as well as the University of Chicago Education Labs. And the scientific literature suggests that tutoring is most effective when it's deeply connected to what's going on in school, ideally taking place during the regular school day to support the great work of our classroom teachers. In addition, the tutoring sessions happen in small ratios of 2 to 3 students, and a student would work with the tutor 3 to 5 times a week for 30 or 50 minutes, and will also work with the same tutor consistently throughout this school year so they can form strong connections and relationships with them. And lastly, we're not talking about ad hoc or just homework help tutoring support. We're talking about intentionally designed structured programs that align with either state standards or classroom instruction. And that requires an intentional approach to having high quality instructional materials, as well as training and ongoing professional development for tutors. So moving along from those key tenets, taking a look at what's happening nationally, we see a growing convergence around high impact tutoring, not only as a way to mitigate against the effects of COVID-19, but also thinking long-term in changing the way we think about educational delivery in the future. Right now, states across the country have invested $4.2 billion in relief funds for accelerated learning, specifically earmarked for tutoring. The 74 and EdWeek published a study that suggests that 10% of the students across the country are receiving high impact tutoring. I know right now that there is some questions around the precision of that exact number, but setting that aside, I think there's something that is undoubtable, is that there's no doubt, right, that there is considerable traction and there's significant aspirations for increasing this number over time. And the last thing is, there was a interesting RAND report that was recently published where they had a representative survey of principals and teachers nationwide, specifically around STEM education and the action steps that we need to take to accelerate our ability to help students thrive in the STEM field, which are really important for kind of the ability to join new workforce opportunities in the United States. And when they surveyed principals and teachers, the number one strategy that they identified that's going to be central to helping to mitigate against the inequities that are happening right now in STEM education is high impact tutoring. And again, that survey and that analysis by RAND just again points to the fact that people are thinking about high impact tutoring, not just in the context of COVID-19 recovery, but as a really great tool and strategy long-term. Now, taking a step back from this national overview, I'd love to transition now to our conversation with Commissioner Schwinn and Kenneth Stowe. I don't know if Commissioner Schwinn has made it on the call yet. However, I would love for you, Kenneth, to tell us a little bit more about what is happening with high impact tutoring in New Mexico, and specifically why you decided to move forward with kind of a statewide tutoring initiative and what it looks like.
Thank you so much, AJ, for passing the mic over to me. As you can see, the slide is a little bit busy. We're doing a lot when it comes to high impact, high dosage tutoring here in New Mexico. The first thing is we're working on kind of like a top down and a bottom up model, right? So let's start with the bottom up. We want to create models of sustainability out there in our districts and schools so that they can implement and provide high dosage tutoring, high impact tutoring supports to their students, not just now, all these ESSER funds are around, right? But way into the future. So what we did is we opened up an RFP, and Saga Education was awarded a partnership through that RFP to provide direct supports to districts and schools for high impact tutoring implementation. So what does that mean? Saga Education helps districts and schools with scheduling. It's the most important thing, right? If there's not time within the school day to provide this service, everything kind of falls apart. Hiring tutors, identifying tutors, the curriculum alignment with the classroom is really important. So that's kind of where we started back in, oh my gosh, January of 2022 now. And it's been so great working alongside Saga Education because they've been in other states, they know how it works, and they know some of the lessons learned from that. Building off of that, we're making additional investments when it comes to high dosage tutoring here in our state. So in the bottom up model, we're starting with providing middle school math supports next year. So all middle schools in the state can leverage our high dosage tutoring supports free of cost. We're doing early literacy supports in our literacy model schools. We're also doing some real creative stuff, right, with near peer tutoring and our ed fellows. Those are education assistants that are aspiring to be teachers, supporting them in doing small group intervention, high dosage tutoring work there. But that was not quite enough for us here in New Mexico. So we wanted to do a top-down model as well. So what we did is we started with supports for 500 8th and 9th grade students in Algebra 1. We really realized that Algebra 1 is a key area where we see a lot of slide when it comes to proficiency. So we started by opening up 500 slots, and we provide that tutoring direct to students. 8th grade students, it's like a model of best practice when we think about the concept of learning acceleration. We want to get our 8th grade students pre-exposed to those 9th grade standards before they end up in the classroom and are having difficulty with accessing that content. But then also for our 9th grade students that need that credit recovery towards graduation, that's so very important too. So we offer that as well. We are also this summer starting out with 6th grade math. We see a lot of slide and proficiency when students are going from that elementary to that middle school context. So we want to work with 5th grade students, get them pre-exposed to that 6th grade content and standards, and then early literacy. I'm really excited for this partnership. We're taking on 750 students over the summer. We are leveraging our New Mexico teachers who are trained in the science of reading to provide that tutoring in a virtual model. So everything I just said about this top-down model that we're going direct to families and students, that is all virtual. And then what we're wanting to do with our partnerships with districts and schools is really work with them on embedding this high dosage tutoring support in an in-person model, because we know that that's what works best for our students. And of course, I'm going to sit here and say everything is working great. Like our initial data from our top-down supports in Algebra 1 shows that 89% of our students that are sticking with us, right, are achieving at or above grade level proficiency. And we have partnered with the University of Chicago and MDRC to do independent efficacy studies, because like I said, of course, I'm going to sit here and say that everything's great. I want someone else to be able to tell the department and our stakeholders and families throughout the state that this is a model that works for their students.
I love that. And I, as a data-driven organization myself, I fully understand the power of working with outside evaluators to help you understand the impact of your work. And so it's really encouraging to hear about some of the data metrics of the students who are involved. I'll be curious, what other impact are you seeing, or what response are you seeing either from students or teachers, parents?
You know what I would say, the best thing that we've seen are the emails that come in from students and families saying thank you so much. We recently were featured in the Santa Fe New Mexican, that's our local newspaper here in Santa Fe. They went out and they interviewed some families and they interviewed some parents, and it's really just been heartwarming and grounding. Those are the words that I would use to show the sense of relief that parents are experiencing when they're like, oh my gosh, my child is coming home and doing homework on their own, and they're not like in tears out of frustration. So more than the percentages and the proficiency, like that is our North Star. We want students to gain access and proficiency on our state adopted standards, but the stories of success that are coming from our families and students is important.
That's really encouraging. And we all know it's not all flowers and daisies. This is, we're kind of we're dealing with a once in a century education, crisis. And I know that high impact tutoring is part of the portfolio of things you're doing to support students at this time. And as you embark and make investments in this work, what are some of the challenges you're facing, and what are some of the opportunities you see down the road?
Yeah, challenges, there are many, right? One is with our top-down models, we did that after school hours and on the weekends, right? So what we're seeing is it's difficult for students to stick with that 3 45-minute sessions a week for 14 weeks. That is a big commitment, right? And so there's been a lot of lessons learned when it comes to student retention in that after school and weekend model. That's kind of why we're doing a lot of pivoting to focus on school day embedded next year, because let's catch students while they're at school and working on school work. Some other things, scheduling is so very important when we're talking to districts and schools. If a school doesn't have a set time to provide interventions or small group supports, then like what we hear is, oh, we just have kids come 30 minutes before school twice a week and nobody shows up. Well, no wonder, because you're asking them to come before school for 30 minutes, like they're walking in tired, and by the time they sit down, they're already standing back up. So working with districts and schools on their scheduling policies is also very important. A lesson learned on the tutoring front, on the tutor pool front, we are really trying to focus on our rural and low-income communities throughout the state. We are a rural state, and that's very important to show that we can support those students and communities. Well, they don't have retired teachers to tap into, right? They may not have a local university where they can pull in higher ed students to provide tutoring. So providing virtual push-in tutors is very important for our rural communities. And another lesson learned on the tutor front is, who is a good tutor? It's been really surprising. We open the door to current teachers, retired teachers, military personnel, and students that are seeking a higher ed degree in the content area, either teaching, math, or English language arts, literacy, one of those content areas. Our college students are some of the most engaging tutors. And I think it's because one, like they usually aren't working a full day's worth of work and then hopping on as a tutor, but it's just been very pleasing to see the engagement and partnership with our higher ed institutions and the students in those institutions that are working as tutors.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, essentially, you recognize that there's a large pool of people we could potentially tap into to be effective tutors, right? And naming college tutors as one. I want to go back to one thing before we talk about the policy considerations. I know a lot of people here attending today are very interested on kind of how New Mexico is approaching this, how Tennessee is approaching things from a policy perspective. But you said something I think is quite provocative for many, is the fact that you're providing live online tutoring. And it's just like, wait, what? Well, you're doing what? Tell me a little bit more why you decided to move forward with that kind of approach to support students.
Yeah, AJ, that's a good question. It really goes back to addressing the needs of our rural communities. And doing that live virtual push-in model meets that need, right? So next year, what we're doing is we're working with districts and schools, identifying that time during the school day that we can push in a tutor. Students go to that room, they receive that live virtual instruction, and that virtual model, it's really, to put it simply, it's based off of the needs of our rural communities. Who just simply don't have access to community partners, organizations that can provide tutoring services directly to them.
Got it. Now, shifting gears a bit. So we've talked a little bit about implementation, and we can really get into the weeds on those things. Let's think a little bit more about policy. So what do you think are really important policy considerations at the state level or the federal level that you think are really important to support effective implementation of high impact tutoring?
Yeah, AJ, there's a lot there. And I'll say that New Mexico, we are still learning lessons. But the biggest thing that I can recommend is that you keep research and data as the North Star. There are a lot of vendors out there that will promise the moon for pennies, and you got to be suspicious of that. And you have to have that research and data at the forefront of any sort of funding that the legislature is going to put forward towards tutoring. When you get that funding, you're going to have to probably do some sort of procurement. So being very clean on your RFP processes and making sure that what you need and what you need out of the data and what you want to see out of student success is built into those procurements, right? That's very important. Really, and also to make sure that things tie to standards, right? Another thing that's really important is we want to see students showing success on your state standards, whether you're Common Core, whether you're Texas and you got your own standards, right? We want to see students making success on those standards. So ensuring that the tutoring supports that you're providing is tied to a grade appropriate standard. And then also in the best model, when we were talking about embedding in the school day, how is that tutoring tied to the core instructional environment, right? Or even better, let's take it to the next level. How is that tutoring leveraging the high quality instructional materials that students are seeing in the core instructional environment, right? So it's that systems coherence between core instruction and the intervention and high dosage tutoring space that's really important. So, AJ, the slide that you showed earlier with all of those key tenets of high impact tutoring that came out of the University of Chicago, that the policy considerations advice when it comes to policy is follow that, right? When you keep the research and you keep the data as the North Star, the student outcomes will follow. And at least that's what we've seen here in New Mexico.
That's great. And have there been any federal policy initiatives or funding opportunities that have been particularly helpful for the state of New Mexico as it explores this opportunity?
Well, I would say that not a whole lot from the federal level federal policy has really guided our work. We have really done a lot of research and reaching out to other states that have been down this road. Oklahoma is one of them that we partnered with early on. So, AJ, I'm not quite sure. Maybe you rephrase the question, but I'm not quite sure I'm giving you what you need there.
Yeah, I'd just be curious if there are any particular, how about this, another way of thinking about it, do you think what advice, I suppose, would you give federal policymakers and other state leaders to continue to support effective high impact tutoring long term?
Yeah, the funding is one, right? When we are in conversation with our legislature during our legislative sessions, we definitely try to show and demonstrate the success that we have seen in our high dosage tutoring programs. And really it's all of it's driven by the funding. We see states throughout the country that are propping up high dosage, high impact tutoring programs using their ESSER funding. Well, that goes away September 30th, 2024. So how do legislatures, policy officials at both the national and state levels really provide funding and policies that create models of sustainability to keep that good work moving forward?
Yeah. So how are you thinking about that right now? So as you think about, in a world beyond ESSER, what are the key things you would have to see to make a compelling case that, hey, this should be part maybe of how we approach supporting students or supporting teachers long term, maybe as some high priority growth years? Are there particular metrics or things you're looking to learn to get better insight around that?
I had to take a sip of my coffee, AJ, while you were talking. Yeah, again, really focusing on the content and grade levels that will demonstrate the most growth, right? So we're focusing on early literacy, because why? We see that so very important. When students don't gain grade level proficiency in those early grades when it comes to literacy, they are seeing problems way through their K through 12 career, right? Focusing on middle school math is so very important because, well, that's where our data shows we're seeing a lot of slide. Focusing on those content areas and partnering with schools for our high school students to gain lost credit and get that diploma that they've been working for is really important. And then keeping the metrics and stories of success first, right? So, you focus on your core areas where you can see and demonstrate that you're meeting a need. You ensure that you have solid data to show that students that stick with your program achieve proficiency and mastery on those grade level standards. And then you keep in close contact with your teachers, your families, and your students to be gathering those stories of success. Because, I tell you what, when next year rolls around and I am talking to our legislative body around, hey, there's good work's going, you want to help us? Those are the kinds of stories and metrics that I'm going to be using to demonstrate that this is working for our New Mexico students.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate you sharing those things. And I have a few things to add from a policy perspective. As states and districts continue to invest in high impact tutoring, there's important policy considerations that we think as Saga Education will be really helpful. And it's starting off with what Ken mentioned before, being very clear and outlining hallmarks that lead to success. So providing voluntary guidance for evidence-based high-impact tutoring. And I really want to emphasize this concept of voluntary, because flexibility is really important to district leaders. And so if they want to go outside those key tenets, they can, but they ought to be encouraged to conduct additional evaluations of some sort to see if, in fact, it was a good idea to do so. The second thing I think is really interesting from a policy lens is that high impact tutoring is an exciting way to explore how we can approach cultivating and nurturing the next generation of highly qualified teachers. And so from a state perspective, like if you do invest in high impact tutoring, not only is it an approach for accelerated learning, it can also be an approach for human capital. And from a state lens, you can think about creating intentional policies to create tutor to teacher pathways. And so you can think about partnerships with your state universities, thinking about your policies around alternative teacher certification, student loan forgiveness, maybe practicum credit as some ideas to start to explore. The other thing, and it ties to actually a question that I see in the Q&A, if as a state you want to create flexibility for schools to integrate high impact tutoring during the regular school day, creates an opportunity to explore and think about policies around time and learning, to allow evidence-based tutoring to perhaps be a course for credit so that students can stay on track for graduation as long as it aligns with the standards that you set out as a state. And the other thing that's really important to emphasize is that from the evidence from the University of Chicago Education Lab and other researchers, we've highlighted an area worthy of additional exploration. And it could be an exciting time for states to appropriate a share of funds for additional randomized trials, quasi-experimental studies on high impact tutoring, and investing in the data infrastructure of districts so that they can do this type of exploration long-term. And lastly, as Ken mentioned, I completely agree here, and thinking about ways in which you can appropriate state funding or encouraging federal funding to support high impact tutoring, maybe in your highest priority districts and your highest priority grade subjects. With nationwide historically has been early literacy in latent math. A lot of data showing that if students can read by grade 3, they're 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. And you also see that 4x effect in Algebra 1, 9th grade Algebra 1. If students are able to pass 9th grade Algebra 1, they're also 4 times more likely to earn a high school diploma. So with that said, I'm going to transition to some Q&A. And also, Kenneth, I would see if you disagree or agree with any of those suggestions as well. Would love to hear your thoughts.
I definitely agree with each of those suggestions, AJ. Yeah. All
right. So jump into this first question here, which ties into, this is a common question I get all the time. All right. I'm sold on this idea of implementing tutoring. Where the heck do I get all these tutors? You know, knowing that there's an educator shortage going on with teachers, how do we avoid having a tutor shortage? Well, what are your thoughts on that, Ken?
I would say the best way to avoid that tutor shortage is to embed the tutoring within the school day and leverage your teachers that are already there, right? If your schools have, a lot of times in elementary school, they're called intervention hours, walk to intervention hours, right? In the secondary context, it might be an advisory hour. Whatever that is, just be thoughtful about your current personnel and how you can shift folks around to provide that individualized small group instructional support and high dosage tutoring that's embedded in the school day. Leveraging our retired teachers, leveraging other folks in a virtual model is another way that you can support that, right? So you might have a large urban area where you have access to folks that are interested in doing this, that want to get trained up, want to work with students, are going to pass those federal background checks and everything. That's very important. Student security is important. Working with those folks, getting those folks identified, trained up, and then pushing into your rural communities in a virtual model is another way to go about it. But best practice, nothing beats embedded in the school day and leveraging the personnel you already have there available to you.
Yeah, I think that in addition to that, tying into what you're talking about earlier, there's a lot of potential in live online tutoring, especially for rural communities have access to this type of evidence-based approach. When you're not constrained by geography, right, you dramatically open the pool of folks you can qualify to be tutors with you, and looking for people who have certain skill sets that you think are really relevant for the communities and the context you're serving. The next question here, I mean, the folks attending are pretty smart. They're up to date on recent news. We have a question here around like why recently New Mexico terminated a contract with a tutoring provider. And I'd love to get your ideas like why that decision was made.
Yeah, AJ, just to say that, one, we keep students first, and we definitely hold our vendors responsible for demonstrating gains for our students, right? And without getting too much into the weeds, that vendor just really wasn't able to produce the kind of learning results and data that we were looking for in order to justify us leveraging our state and federal funds to provide that service to students. Again, I kind of opened up by saying a lot of folks will offer the moon and say it's going to cost you pennies, and you really need to be you really need to have your suspicions about that, and you really need to understand what is this really going to look like for a student, how is the student going to access this, and what data is the vendor going to be able to provide to demonstrate that this is working, because that's our charge as state and local education administrators, right? That we are being good stewards of federal and state funds, that we are leveraging vendors that can produce results for our students.
I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the idea of keeping students first and thinking about what's best, given the resources you have. The next question we have here is a bit technical, and the answer to it, I know it's going to vary from state to state because every state has different policies around it. But one question we have here is really talking about the intersection of licensure requirements and making high impact tutoring part of the regular schedule. So so if you're working with college students, and they're providing tutoring, let's say during the school day, like how is New Mexico approaching it from an SEA requirements, and requiring like a certified teacher to be in the room to have a course for credit. So like, how are you all thinking about that as a state?
Yeah, no, that's actually some lessons learned from Saga Education, right? We always have a teacher of record that acts as a tutor supervisor, right? We are able to leverage our college students that are seeking a higher degree in, say, math, and we do federal background checks. We get them trained up on Saga's model. Saga provides really good training for our tutors. And we do randomized observations and checks with those tutors to ensure that what they're providing is actually working for students. But the licensure functions much in the same way as, say, an EA or any other community member that you would push into the classroom to provide some of these supports. We always have a teacher of record that is identified as a tutor supervisor for any tutors that are providing services directly to students there at the school.
Right. And I think that's and if you do have a site director in the room, that person who's responsible for, like I say, managing or coaching the tutors, that person can also be a teacher of record if that person is a certified teacher within your state as well. Is another question relating to implementation, and for your context, Kenneth, like how many students per school, and how does the school schedule around like the tutoring session? Like for you and your context, like are students missing something, or there's many different ways schools are approaching scheduling?
If I understand the question correctly, it's kind of like, how do we support schools in identifying the students that are going to benefit the most from high impact tutoring, and how do they work with that scheduling? Because, you only have so many teachers, you only have so many hours. The first thing that we do is we want to make sure that, there's a lot in my mind right now, AJ. I'm just going to go down the list and you stop me. So the first thing is the stigmatization of tutoring is something you really want to be careful about. When you say have 100 students in 7th grade reading, right, and 20 of them really need high impact tutoring and need to benefit from that, when you send those 20 students to a classroom all of their own, right, and nothing else is going on with those other 80 kids, it really creates some sort of stigma inside students of, well, what did I do wrong? Like, why am I in this room by myself? Another thing that's related to that is when we're scheduling our intervention times, ensuring that we're not pulling students out of specials and electives is so very important, right? Because when you're saying, Ken, you're going to have to give up band or athletics because you aren't doing so hot in math, and so you're not going to be able to participate in that all year. Sometimes for our secondary students, those electives is what brings them into the building, right? So one, being very thoughtful about who we identify as needing tutoring. We have our MTSS initiative is called multi-layered system of supports. Why? Because we're in New Mexico. We love to do stuff different. So we have MLSS, but we really work with schools to use their benchmark and interim and formative data to identify the bubble kids that are going to benefit most. So those usually tier 2 kids and some of those tier 3 kids that would benefit most from this small group direct intervention support, whether you want to call it high impact tutoring or small group intervention. So one, it is ensuring that there's some thought around the stigmatization. Two, really providing some thought around who we are identifying. That really kind of helps ease the school systems and, oh my gosh, I need to do this for all of my 7th grade kids here at the school. I don't know if that answered your question, AJ. I went on a bit of a tangent there.
Felt good. I appreciate the thoughtfulness behind it, and I think that's all the time we have for questions. And before I normally pass it back to Maisha, I'd just like to thank you, Ken, for taking time to be on here, be with us to share your story. I think from Saga's perspective, in a world beyond ESSER, I think schools and districts implementing high impact tutoring on their own is the pathway for scale and sustainability. If we find a way to make this part of the fabric of how we approach budgeting, scheduling, human capital, like you create the conditions where it can be a lasting support for students and teachers. And I'm just really grateful of New Mexico exploring that. It takes a lot of courage to try to shake up the status quo and do something like this. And the lessons you're learning are just going to lift the field. So I really appreciate you sharing your story. And with that said, I want to warmly pass it to Maisha to close things out.
Well, thank you to our audience for all of those great questions. We really appreciate each of you joining us today. Thank you also to AJ Gutierrez for moderating today's webinar. And we are so appreciative of today's expert, Kenneth Stowe, who has given us such great insight into the application of high impact tutoring in his state. To our audience, please remember that Education Commission of the States is here to support you in your work. So we hope that you're taking away at least one idea from today's session that may support you in the great work you're doing in your state. And if you have any questions or requests related to today's session, please reach out to Lauren Paysach, policy researcher here at ECS. Today's recorded session will be shared in your post-event email. And finally, join us next month for our conversation on funding student success in Tennessee. It'll take place June 14th. Expect to receive the invite soon, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again for your time today.